Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I beg to move that the Preservation of Human Dignity and Enforcement of Economic and Social Rights Bill 2022, be read a second time. Mr. Speaker, this bill is a very, very important bill, and it should have come yesterday. Mr. Speaker, this bill is a bill that proposes to give effect to one of the most important constitutional articles that we passed in the 2010 Constitution. Mr. Speaker, in constitutional law, there are those that are called first-generation rights. And these first-generation rights, Mr. Speaker, are those rights where the people who fought for independence, for example, in this country, they fought because their lives, their right to life, their right to living without discrimination, their right to living in a land that they call their own, their right, Mr. Speaker, the basic human rights who are being derogated by the colonialists. Mr. Speaker, those rights resulted in the independent freedom fighters, and it's not just in Kenya. But when you look across the African continent, Mr. Speaker, you would find that people, legends like Sam Nujoma of SWAPO, legends like Nelson Mandela of the Umkhonto we Sizwe, and many others, Mr. Speaker, Robert Mugabe, they fought because of the first generation rights. They fought so that their people can get what belonged to them and the colonialists had taken from them. Mr. Speaker, then these people set up the first governments, and after these first governments were set up, we started talking about the second generation rights. And these second generation rights, Mr. Speaker, are basically economic rights. The 2010 constitution that brought a new era into Kenya, it tried to capture the socio-economic rights that we also know as second generation rights. And Mr. Speaker, these rights, they deal with the way that people should live in a dignified manner, in a way that ensures they have decent housing, they have a source of income, they have socio-economic rights that they exercise within the country in which they exist. So, Mr. Speaker, this is one of the acts of parliament that was supposed to be brought so that the economic and social rights of our people in this country can be realized. And Mr. Speaker, this bill, it tries to set up the framework in which there will be preservation of the dignity of the Kenyan people. There will also be promotion and monitoring of the social rights that are sought to be enforced in this bill. There will be, Mr. Speaker, mechanisms that will be established also to monitor and promote the social and economic rights of the Kenyan people. Mr. Speaker, there will be a requirement for county governments to adhere to the promotion of these social and economic rights. So that, Mr. Speaker, this Senate will be setting a new order that will be requiring all 47 counties to reshape their budgets, to reshape their approach to budget making, so that, Mr. Speaker, at the end of it, the Constitution is achieved, the constitutional goals are achieved. And the main one in this particular case being the giving or guaranteeing of the peoples in the Kenya, in the various counties, their social and economic rights. Mr. Speaker, what are these economic and social rights that we are talking about? This bill defines them in proposed section 2 of the bill, and they say these are the rights accruing to every person in this country, and they are captured under Articles 43(1) and 53(1)(c) of the current Constitution. Mr. Speaker, they include the highest attainable standards of health, which includes the right to healthcare services. Mr. Speaker, very many counties, including my own county, Mr. Speaker, Tana River County, health services have degraded. Emergency services are degraded. In fact, Mr. Speaker, in Tana River County today, if you happen to fall sick and you need emergency treatment, the Hola Referral Hospital would quickly write a note for you to go to Kilifi County Hospital, which is our neighbor, or they will take you to Garissa. Mr. Speaker, those are not referral hospitals, but because of the degraded situations of the hospitals, Mr. Speaker, that is the current situation obtaining. And this bill, Mr. Speaker, tends to force county governments to treat healthcare as an emergency, as a social and economic right that must be guaranteed by the counties. Not only in Tana River County, Mr. Speaker, but also in other counties. This bill forces the governors in various counties to make sure that the rights, the socio-economic rights of the people are not degraded and forgotten about. Mr. Speaker, it includes accessible to adequate housing. Mr. Speaker, adequate housing is a problem, especially in urban areas. This bill will force counties to start thinking about real provision of housing for their people, to start thinking about how our people who are living in various counties are going to be housed. Mr. Speaker, this bill will force counties in their development plans to capture the need for housing for our people, because this bill will force them to think about this right of housing in the long term. So that, Mr. Speaker, we will be forced, like in European countries, American countries, and even some of the more advanced nations in other parts of the world, that when you are planning in a county, when you are planning in a state, you are forced to even plan for new housing, new cities, new amenities for people in advance, because you are looking at the statistics of the birth rate. So this is one of those bills that is going to force the planning to take into account housing. Mr. Speaker, reasonable standards of sanitation must be guaranteed by all county governments under this bill. Mr. Speaker, if you go to very many parts of the nation, including the major cities of this country, including the city, the capital city of Kenya, Mr. Speaker, sanitation is a problem. It is not only a problem in the major cities, even in cities that are coming, in urban centers that are coming, in municipalities that are coming up, such as the Hola municipality. Mr. Speaker, in Tana River County, you will find that when it rains, Mr. Speaker, there is a problem. Water cannot move. Houses are so close. There is no proper sanitation system. Mr. Speaker, we appreciate the World Bank grant that has been given, and it is being applied in various municipalities, including my own municipality in Hola County, in Hola town. Mr. Speaker, that World Bank grant is the first attempt at trying to set up proper sanitation systems. This bill, Mr. Speaker, is going to be saying the county governments will be, it will be forced to think about sanitation in terms of planning in the allocation of resources. Mr. Speaker, reasonable standards of clean water and safe waters in adequate quantities. Mr. Speaker, many counties suffer water shortages. Many counties suffer inadequate or unsafe water facilities. Mr. Speaker, I can say with authority that a county such as Tana River, the Tana River Water Resources Organization, the TAWASCO, has failed the people. For many days, people will go without water. And when the bills come, they will come like you have been collecting water and receiving water throughout. The water that comes, they bring the same water from Tana River, the River Tana. The water that comes from your tap is brown. And it becomes very difficult for the people even to be sure that the water they are receiving is clean and safe. Mr. Speaker, this bill addresses itself to standards of water that is provided to the people. It forces county governments, Mr. Speaker, such as my county and many other counties, to think about putting money, proper money, and proper reticulation systems that the water they are providing to the people in our 47 counties, it is water that is safe, that meets hygienic standards, that, Mr. Speaker, can support proper life on their counties. Mr. Speaker, this bill also, it talks about the right to be free from hunger and to provide adequate food and in adequate quantities to the people. Mr. Speaker, this bill is trying to say that there are social and economic rights within the Constitution. And this is now the bill that is forcing those rights to be enforced in our counties. Mr. Speaker, right now, before the rains started, people have been going hungry. You find many children unable to attend school because there is no food. Mr. Speaker, pictures have been circulated in some of our social media in Tana River County, for example. You find a child has gone to school. They have struggled because they want to get education, and they have walked all the way to school. But then when they reach school, Mr. Speaker, the same child is found sleeping, actually sleeping on the floor. Because during lunchtime, when there is a break the child is not able to play. The child is not able to be effective in terms of even communication with the other children. So, Mr. Speaker, this bill is making it compulsory for county governments, not just in Tana River County, but in all 47 counties, that in their planning, they will give effect to social and economic rights, which include the right to have food. Governors, going forward, they will be forced to plan that the population which they are leading are not people who are dying of starvation. Mr. Speaker, in this bill, there is a requirement that national government and county government, they work together so that these two levels of government can deal with the actual needs of the people. Mr. Speaker, while we have hunger in this country, Mr. Speaker, you will find that the priorities that have occupied certain counties, Mr. Speaker, are not reflecting of the hunger situation. You'll find many of them are starting, they have planned to construct new buildings. Not grain storages, Mr. Speaker. Not water pans where they can tap water. They are planning, Mr. Speaker, to buy new cars for the governors who have just been elected, Mr. Speaker. They will find money, Mr. Speaker, for new housing for speakers, new housing or completion of housing for governors who have not built their houses. They will find money for allowances to travel trips, to go for trainings, to go abroad, and they will take big, nice pictures, Mr. Speaker, of county delegations visiting all over the world. But the planning is not capturing the fact that there is hunger. Mr. Speaker, this bill is a bill that will force county governments, will force county assemblies and the treasuries in those counties to make sure that they are planning for the basic necessity, the dignity of the human person, the Kenyan person. He will now have an opportunity to say truly, independence has come. Mr. Speaker, this bill is intent on giving social security and social assistance to the lowest of the law. Mr. Speaker, county governments and the national governments under this bill, they will be forced to look at their budgets and see how they can support people who are at the bottom of the ladder. Mr. Speaker, this bill is saying that county governments must come up with creative ways. There must be no people sleeping hungry in your places. In European countries, Mr. Speaker, where they have social democracy and their governments are in power, you will find that they will create in the local authorities something called soup kitchen, where people are allowed to go and eat something. You don't sleep hungry in that country, Mr. Speaker. They create areas where if life has beaten you, it has battered you to the point that you've lost all, you can run to a place which is a shelter. And, Mr. Speaker, you organize yourself. They are not very good, but you organize yourself. You don't die. You organize yourself in time for you to go back to the workforce. Mr. Speaker, in the US and in various states, they provide for food coupons as part of their social assistance agenda, depending on which state you come from. Mr. Speaker, food coupons are given to people who maybe are out of work. They don't have food, and literally they are starving. So they are allowed to access a coupon which they can take to, say, in our country, if you are to localize it, You can take to Tuskys supermarket, and those food coupons are specific. They'll be saying you are allowed to take maybe 3 or 4 packets of unga, 1 packet of rice, and so on, sugar and so on. And the food coupon, once it is given to the owner of that supermarket, it becomes cash for him, because when he takes it and goes to the bank, it is converted into his actual funds. So, Mr. Speaker, if you look at the objects and purposes of this bill, they actually capture the provisions of the Constitution that address themselves to the economic and social rights of the people of Kenya. And this bill tries to enforce it. Mr. Speaker, there has not been a bill that has really tried to come to make it happen. Mr. Speaker, it has been left to political parties to try and say we are a social democracy, or we are going to do this when we get into power. We will give you 6,000 every household. It has been left to political leaders. Governors have come up with manifestos, different governors. At the presidential level, political parties and candidates have come with different manifestos. But, Mr. Speaker, these manifestos are not based in law. It is just a program that may or may not be followed. But this bill is saying that you are now required by law, when we pass this bill, to ensure that there is human dignity. So one of the major objects and purposes of this act is to make sure the preservation of the human dignity is there. Mr. Speaker, this bill brings the realization of economic and social rights by national and county governments. Mr. Speaker, with this bill, every president will now have to be bottom up. Every governor will now have to be bottom up. They'll have to be thinking of the lowest people in our land. Because this bill, when it becomes law, Mr. Speaker, it will force the national and county governments to realize economic and social rights for the people of Kenya. It will force them. It will be now mandatory, very mandatory, for the national government to plan and think, how are the lowest of the law going to be protected under my government, under my administration? It will force every governor by law to make sure that the lowest of the law in his county are protected. Mr. Speaker, this bill in its objects and purposes also says we want to create a monitoring mechanism. So it has not been left to the president or the governor to do as he pleases, to make sure that maybe it is only one program that will succeed, the others no. There is established in this bill, it is proposed to establish a mechanism that will monitor. It will monitor to see that food is given to the hungry people. It will monitor to see that water is made available to the people of your county and the nation. It will monitor this mechanism that is proposed in this bill, Mr. Speaker. Will monitor that adequate water, adequate housing, adequate sanitation, Mr. Speaker, is achieved under any administration, whether it is this governor or this president, and when they move out, those programs must continue with the next government in the county level and the next government in the national level. Mr. Speaker, there is the application of the Equalization Fund. Mr. Speaker, for a long time, the Equalization Fund has not had a way in which it can work. There's been a problem even in defining which are the marginalized areas. For us who have been in leadership for some time, and having walked across this breadth and length of our nation, we know that there are some areas where there is always rain. Some counties where there is always food. And we know there are counties which have shortfall of rainfall. We know that there are counties that will not also have rain and they suffer from drought for a long time. Mr. Speaker, the marginalized areas are supposed to be the beneficiaries of this Equalization Fund that was set up under the Constitution. And the reason being that the Equalization Fund was supposed to help counties such as Tana River County, which have been left behind, Mr. Speaker, because of poor government policies of successive government, where there was, in fact, formalization through some white papers that there will be areas that will be developed and others which will be left behind. Apparently, those areas that are supposed to be developed, Mr. Speaker, are those areas that are supposed to be high potential. Mr. Speaker, this Equalization Fund is supposed to benefit counties such as ourselves. You will find there is very little road network in terms of tarmac roads in a place like Tana River County, Mr. Speaker. You will find that there is very little in terms of real infrastructure developments, like a lot of electricity. Just a few in towns and that's it, Mr. Speaker. So this bill, Mr. Speaker, it wants to make this fund operational. This fund was supposed to work for only 20 years. But leaders have not been able to agree. Counties that we know are rich, they have good soils, they have been receiving grains, they have been having surpluses in terms of agriculture. They have also come back to say, we are also marginalized in some parts. So it has been difficult to agree on what is a marginalized area. So this bill attempts, Mr. Speaker, to resolve that problem, that impasse. That impasse, Mr. Speaker, has made Treasury to have this money stay in Treasury, a justification that has continued to deny the people who deserve to have this money come to their counties. So, Mr. Speaker, this bill is a very good bill because it attempts, if it is passed today, at least there is an attempt to start operationalization of this Equalization Fund. Mr. Speaker, in fact, now I am aware that the 20 years period that was allocated to the Equalization Fund are almost coming to an end without the Equalization Fund actually being operationalized because of squabbles. This bill, Mr. Speaker, it attempts to sort out that problem, and it attempts to bring a mechanism in which we know who are the marginalized areas by law, and so who are supposed to receive the Equalization Fund. Mr. Speaker, this bill is a bill that creates a mechanism for the national government and the county government to cooperate in dealing with the real issues affecting our people in this country. Mr. Speaker, we know that some of the county governments have had their priorities in terms of budgeting, up and down. And we witness this, Mr. Speaker, when you sit in the Senate Public Accounts Committees, when they are being grilled by the Senate Public Accounts Committee, you'd see a lot of these counties, Mr. Speaker, they are not just prioritizing what is the people's needs. So, Mr. Speaker, this bill attempts to put the people in front. It attempts to force even the national government to put the people in front. And not just this president, Mr. Speaker, but future president. They will be forced to cooperate with county government so that the needs of the people at the lower scale of the dichotomy of the economy will benefit. Mr. Speaker, this bill, it goes on to promote sustainable development. Why I say sustainable is because, Mr. Speaker, if only the GDP is measured in terms of the top people, there's so much maybe industrialization taking place, but people are hungry, Mr. Speaker, that is not sustainable. Mr. Speaker, as I've said before, this bill is involved, very much keyed in the promotion of good governance and accountability to every bearer of office, Mr. Speaker, so that for the first time, Mr. Speaker, if this bill is implemented, then for the first time, transparency and accountability, availability of services will be enhanced by law. Mr. Speaker, national government has been given obligations, and equally, county governments have been given obligations under this bill. Mr. Speaker, the national government will have to formulate and implement policies, strategies, and legislations that will bring to realization social and economic rights. Mr. Speaker, which means every president who will come to Kenya will have this continuing burden that they must come up with ideas. They must come up with new formulations, with new policies, Mr. Speaker, that will carry the majority of our people who are in the lower scale of the economy. Mr. Speaker, the national government is enforced by this bill, by the passing of this bill, to ensure, Mr. Speaker, that every social service will be made available, Mr. Speaker. And they will have to report what they are doing towards making the social services available so that our people can start living decent lives. Mr. Speaker, I have the singular honor of heading the delegation for the Pan-African Parliament. And just the other day, Mr. Speaker, we were in Midrand, South Africa, for a session of the Pan-African Parliament. Mr. Speaker, part of the duty is to also look at what other countries are doing. Mr. Speaker, we had the opportunity to have a reconnaissance in Soweto. Yes, it is supposed to be a slum, Mr. Speaker. And it is supposed to be one of the biggest slums, like others that are supposed to be, Alexandria and so on. But Mr. Speaker, when you go to those places, there is tarmac roads. There are tarmac roads, there is electricity, water is flowing, there is sanitation. Okay, the houses are small, maybe overcrowded, but there's a roof and a decent life. And the African National Congress government has made it a priority to ensure that some of their promises, of course, like all other governments, they are not fulfilling everything, but some of their promises are working. Mr. Speaker, if you visit those places, yes, they may not have everything, but it's a decent place. You can sleep and go away the next day. Mr. Speaker, contrary to what you will see in a country like Kenya, some of our slums, Mr. Speaker, if there is a fire that occurs in those areas, Mr. Speaker, even emergency services to save life, to preserve life, will not be able to access those areas because there are no roads. When you look properly, sanitation is lacking, no adequate facilities for the people. And yet, Mr. Speaker, to our shame, these are the people who come out in large numbers to vote. They put a lot of faith in us. Even, Mr. Speaker, the alleged protests and maandamanos that are being arranged, the people who are being coerced or induced or easily influenced to come out are these same people who form the bulk of our voters. Mr. Speaker, to our shame, we have never really taken that effort. I think during the time of President Mwai Kibaki, it was the first time that there was an effort at constructing some housing in these low-income areas. And I remember the then Langata MP, the Honorable Raila Odinga, was the first beneficiary of such a project. But it didn't go far enough, Mr. Speaker, because of bad politics. People started saying, oh, what government, come and take your houses. Mr. Speaker, it is different in other parts of the world. And what we are saying is that other national governments that are going to come will now be forced to confront the poverty and the life that our people are living in. That person who comes to drive you, that person who makes your tea, that person who is pushing paper, your secretary and whatever, the lives they live, the leadership by coming into power, into law of this proposed bill, the leadership of our people will be forced to actually address and confront the realities of our people. Mr. Speaker, it will be an obligation of the national government to create and put in place adequate infrastructure that would be necessary to meet the obligation of realizing economic and social rights. Mr. Speaker, the national government will be told they must put this infrastructure. They must go into debt or borrowing or investment or whatever they need to do, but they must put the infrastructure to address the problems of our people. Mr. Speaker, even if it means ceding some land, because some of the people are living in the same Nairobi, Mr. Speaker, very big areas. You know, somebody lives alone in a half an acre, no, in 5 acres alone. 5 acres alone. And because it is so big, he is so insecure. Somebody lives in 10 acres in this same Nairobi, where people are crowded, 10 people living within a small area of occupation. It will force governments, both at the national, to think about these things and to see whether there can be reallocation of land. Purchase these lands from those people who don't need it. Reorganize settlements. Plan for the people who are at the bottom. Let us all be called socialists, but we are thinking about our people. Mr. Speaker, the obligations of the national governments are actually great because they include having a proper campaign to sensitize citizens, Mr. Speaker, on their obligations and duty to ensure that the rights of other citizens are not infringed. Mr. Speaker, the national and county governments, both of them have been given serious responsibilities that, Mr. Speaker, will help towards making these rights a reality. Now, Mr. Speaker, A commission is proposed, Mr. Speaker, that will help in terms of the monitoring and evaluation. And this commission, Mr. Speaker, will help us in terms of getting real results in all these beautiful ideas that have been proposed. Mr. Speaker, in part 4 of this act, proposed act, in this bill, Mr. Speaker, it will be compulsory for county governments to have strategic plans that will address these problems. And each county, Mr. Speaker, will have to deal with programs that are specifically targeted at moving people from the bottom, and if they are there, making them live in a decent and dignified manner. Mr. Speaker, this is a difficult bill, very difficult bill, because it is a bill that needs a lot of thinking, a lot of planning. And Mr. Speaker, it needs a lot of input, and I'm very grateful to their committee for legal for the work they have put in this bill. Mr. Speaker, we are willing to absorb every idea that is coming. We are willing to look at every idea, but somebody must start the train. If we are amending this bill, let's amend it as we go, but we must get going. There must be an effort to start the movement towards helping our people to live a dignified and decent life. This bill is the first attempt. So, Mr. Speaker, I want to just leave it there and say that I am calling upon my colleagues, those who are listening to me over the broadcast, those who are listening to me physically and virtually, Mr. Speaker, let's support this bill. I'm asking my colleagues to be bipartisan about this. Poverty is in both sides, and the challenges are on both sides. These ideas can be improved. We will be welcoming any idea that comes from the other side or this side, minority and majority, because this is a bill that is talking about our people. Mr. Speaker, I beg to move that this bill be read a second time. And I would invite Majority Leader, the Honorable Senator Cheriot, to second. I thank you, Mr. Speaker.